This episode, I'm joined once again by Aaron French to discuss Rudolf Steiner's book, The Philosophy of Freedom. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything running, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Aaron French, once again, thanks for joining me on Hermetics podcast.
Thanks for having me back again.
We are going to be discussing the work of Rudolf Steiner once more, specifically his 1894 book, The Philosophy of Freedom. And if you don't recognize that title, we will get to that in due course, because there is a whole section coming up on titles and translations and the history of this. But this is, roughly speaking, Steiner's third book. And it's split into two sections. So part one of The Philosophy of Freedom, the book we're talking about, provides an account of the relationship between knowledge and perception, arguably about epistemology. Maybe one of the more thorough times Steiner gets very close to what we would consider capital P philosophy. And then part two, though not fully Steinerian in a sense of full-bore spirituality and esotericism, begins to hint more towards what Steiner calls an ethical individualism and a morality, and subtle hints of how human individuals are meant to be in relation to the first part. The reason I say it's not fully Steinerian is because if you're going into this thinking that it's going to be like knowledge of higher worlds or Steiner's known spiritual stuff, it's not like that. But for another grounding for this book, go listen to our previous conversation on Steiner in relation to Stirner, which will give you some other little insights, especially regards ethical individualism. But we're going to approach this book not necessarily linearly in the sense of just going through the content, because actually to go through the content and just tell you the thesis is relatively simple. But when you know about all the other things we're going to talk about to structure the conversation, the content it suddenly becomes not actually as simple as it first seems. That will hopefully all make sense when we get going. But Aaron, so we're beginning with, I mentioned, the titles and the publication date. We're beginning with a historicism here in the history of this book, because it's complicated to say the least, right?
Yeah, well, especially the history is complicated, but the book itself is a little bit strange, It's it fits strangely in, if one wants to put it there, in the history of philosophy. It also fits strangely in the history of esotericism as well. So it's there's a lot going on with it, which is why it's going to takes a bit to unpack it. And I have a whole preamble here about just to set up like even how one should approach talking about or thinking about this book. But if we start with some of the historicism, as you mentioned, which is a good place to start. In the last interview we talked about Steiner getting into these more radical individualist, even anarchist ideas. And as we also mentioned, this is his second or third book, somewhere in there. He had been working on a Goethe book. And then he also was working on his dissertation, which had to do with Fichte. So you can see those influences in there, and naturally Kant, the Kantian influences in there. But also in the background is Nietzsche and Stirner and individualism. And that's a rather hidden in some ways, but also obvious, I suppose, in other ways. But we could get to that. So he writes this after his dissertation and then publishes it at the end of 1893. And he just has like 500 exemplar copies published, but less than 150 of them sold. And these copies were even still around in 1918, when he then wanted to republish a new edition of it. And this is long after his esoteric career. So he says himself that he struggled a long time. Should I do a new version of this or not? And he eventually does it in 1918. And there are some differences in both texts. But going back to the original version, which published in the 1890s, he sent one of these exemplar copies to Edward von Hartmann, who he knew and actually had an affinity for. He praised some of Hartmann's ideas in his earlier work. And Hartmann read the whole thing, annotated it, and sent it back to him, which Apparently, what wasn't isn't that uncommon in those days to do that. As it's sort of marked that I read it, and it's good because look at all my notes in it. But he also had like some criticisms that he definitely criticized it as well, and he said that the title was no good. The title should be epistemological monism and ethical individualism. He said that was a better title because he said the word freedom was misleading and sets up kind of false assumptions for what the book is about, according to him. But so in other words, like many other readers of this book, what is the subject of it? Like, what is the freedom that the book is talking about, and what does this freedom look like? It's not straightforward. And then Steiner later said that Hardeman had misunderstood his intentions and where he was trying to go with this book. And so then in the second edition, he adds a foreword to try to clarify this. This is the second foreword. And so he's like the first two sentences of that foreword are directed basically at Hardeman to try to straighten this out. And there he says, everything in this book, I'll just paraphrase, everything in this book is directed to two questions, two topics. The first is there a certain kind of worldview, philosophical view of the human being that can support it against all doubt and uncertainty that comes to the human from personal experience and from science, two things that can't support themselves and would lead a person into doubt and unknowing if it didn't have some view to support it against it. So he's trying to figure out such a view or create such a view. And the second thing has to do with freedom and whether or not the freedom we think we have is, this is just kind of a classical problem in philosophy. The freedom we think we have, is it true or is it an illusion? And we only think we have it because we really can't see that we're all just directed by natural laws and natural forces and so on. So and biological conditioning. He also in there he says that it's not epistemology. Like this is again directed at I think some other criticisms, but especially at Hardeman. And he says that it's not a book of epistemology. That if you want to call it something, he says you can call it Gedankenmonismus, which is something to translate that's like thought monism. You know, monistic thought, a monism of thoughts. Yeah, so maybe that's where we could start.
The monism versus dualism aspects will probably come in when we mention the actual structure or premise, I guess. Because also you mentioned there this history. There is also, you mentioned briefly the question of translation. So I was using let me get his name right. Is it Michael Wilson translation? So this is the edition, a re-edition by the Rudolf Steiner Press for his 150th anniversary of his birth, which is, with the Michael Wilson translation, with just like two prefaces and then various addendums on like every chapter. So this is like this is an intriguing edition, sort of as a what do you call it? Like an artifact, like an object to actually witness Steiner's own issues and the history of the fact that that first edition wasn't clear, because Steiner is quite literally going back through in the 1918 edition, and the addendums that he adds to like almost every chapter really are very clear, or at least trying to be clear. But then that in itself, along with like this additional thing thrown in at the end by Steiner, I think that in itself does actually transform the whole book, and then you're left with like, what are we meant to do with this whole history? And then alongside that, there is like 3 or 4 other moments of translation, like differences and changes. So it's a book with a history.
Definitely, and it's rather a messy history, I think, as you're pointing out there. And it begins already before in Steiner's own time, because he himself was facing criticism about his like earlier intellectual activity and where he then went later, especially around 1918 when he's extremely popular. So he himself was already facing criticism about like these don't fit somehow, and he wants to say, well, they do fit. So part of the idea of a second edition, 1918, was he was already trying to respond to these criticisms, and that's why he then adds addendums all over in that book and in New Forward, as I mentioned, to try to argue that everything I wrote in that first book still holds true for me now. And it was part of my development, part of the development to these spiritual research writings and lecturings that I'm doing currently. But the fact that he went through and did all that definitely like beefed up the book, but also made it in some ways more clear, perhaps. But in some ways, one could argue it's a little bit more difficult to penetrate with all of the different forewords and addendums, and it's already a lot of philosophical language at times. So, yeah, so it's a difficult book, and even within anthroposophical circles, they talk about how difficult it is, that they know the book is important and they have reading groups to meet and read it. And then people talk about how difficult it is to actually read it. But he did have it translated into English already during his own life. He translated the early version published in 1893, 1894. He had it published and translated in 1916, and he picked the people who translated it. And this was Professor Alfred Hoernlés and his wife Winifred Hoernlés. And they were handpicked as translators based on like how their skills, like how well their German was, and they knew the philosophical background and so on. And Alfred went on to become a professor in South Africa, and he and Winifred were both social activists there for the indigenous African populations and for racial equality. So that's kind of an interesting tidbit of the history there. And yeah, so this was the original version translated into English. You can actually still get it now, even on Rudolf Steiner Archive, the website. They have now put it up there where you can read this older version into English. Steiner then himself revises it in 1918, as we've been talking about. And then after he passes away, this version, this second version, is the one that has been translated and retranslated into English ever since. There was only that one translation of the first one in 1916. But in 1922, the Hoernlés, again, they then did translate the second edition, the 1918. And so that came out in 1922, as I mentioned, and for that they decided to change the title. Mm-hmm. Like Steiner's already passed away at this point. He did pick them to translate the original copy, the original version of the text, and now where he has a second version, then he passes away. So they do one translation on this, but after them, it was all other translations that were translators who were just part of an anthroposophical circles or something. But for this 1922 edition that the Hoernlés did translate, they decided to change the title to The Philosophy of Spiritual Activity. They based this on some remarks that Steiner had made, I believe, while he was lecturing in England about the word Freiheit not translating well as freedom into English. And he said this is because, this is what he thought at least, that in the English language, the word freedom is more passive, comes across as more like a state of being, of freedom. And you simply one can accept this passively and then just believe it. Whereas the freedom he was talking about has to be developed and worked for. And so it's it's an activity. So they changed the title. But then the title was changed back in the 1930s, and there were several more editions appeared in English with the original title. It was then changed back into the other title in the 1980s. And I don't know where it is currently. I mean, different editions are still coming out. And if you go on the Rudolf Steiner website, you can kind of compare these editions and look at them. But the original text does contain some things that are not in the second edition from the 1918. And it contains, and you'll see it if you just start reading it right away, you'll see many more allusions to things like radical individualism and he doesn't mention these thinkers, but I think an astute reader would recognize more readily things in the vein of like Nietzsche and Stirner and so on. And so I have just a couple quotes from the first text that I wanted to read to kind of illustrate this. Mm-hmm. So he starts it off saying, this is a quote from Steiner, quote, "An energetic effort is being made to shake off every kind of authority. Nothing is accepted as valid unless it springs from the roots of individuality. Nothing which hinders the individual in the full development of everything which hinders the individual in the full development of his powers is thrust aside. We will allow no ideals to be forced upon us. We are convinced that in each of us If only we probe deep enough into the very heart of our being, there dwells something noble, something worthy of development. We no longer believe that there is a norm of human life to which we must all strive to conform. End quote. And there's one other quote I want to read from it, but I think it's quite it's a different style, to be honest. I mean, that's part of what you notice. That's a part removed, by the way, from the first. It's right at the beginning. He changes his style, and then it's not like he doesn't still make that. He's not still arguing that, but it's like the style and the language is changed or removed, and we could talk about maybe why we thought he did that. He himself said something in the forward like, I only changed or took out what I felt I said clumsily back then and just updated it now. And then he has like another kind of remark where he says, only ill will would see in what I have done a way to try to like disregard some of my earlier ideas or distance myself or think I'm changing them, according to him. But definitely the style strikes one as more like Nietzschean, more direct in some way, just more more in that vein of that radical individualism that when you're reading Steiner or something, you're like, whoa, like you know, it comes across very provocative, you know.
And we should have mentioned as well, like way down the line, right near the end of his life, I believe, he says this is still the most important book he wrote.
Yeah.
Which is a pretty astounding thing to say after such a career, especially considering what it is. So that's something to throw in there, that this isn't just some early work. But I also am suspicious of the changes, because I know you have that anecdote about him receiving the early copy, right?
Yeah, I can bring that in here also. And so it's like, what is the book? Like, the book was clearly important for him. Even at the end, he decided to do a second edition. If one wants to go participate in some anthroposophical activities, this is usually the book everyone tells you to start with. So it has this kind of like beginning point importance within the movement. And but you know, what is it? One thing before I move to that, though, is just one other quote from the old text that I think also helps in understanding a bit what's going on in this book. And I'll just paraphrase it. And this is also something that it was removed. He talks about philosophy being an art. Right at the beginning, he says this. And he says something like, all philosophers have been artists in concepts, and they then use the scientific method as their artistic techniques. And he said, through this process, philosophers can give abstract thinking concrete individual life and turn ideas into life forces. So he's very strong at the beginning to relate what philosophy is supposed to do and what to art, creative art, and artistic creativity. So that of course is still a theme in the book, but right up front in the early edition, he puts that very clearly. So it's just interesting. So in response or in relation to that, we can move to this second part about what is the book, because it does have to do with art and creativity, perhaps more than something like a book for philosophy students, you know, like how to be creative, really, one could even call it. And this is the activity part, how to develop your creativity. So yeah, he himself also says it's not a book for philosophy students. The anecdote you were referring to is that when he was deciding to redo the second edition, publish the second edition, the publisher sent him the dummy copy that just has the cover on it, and all the pages are just blank, you know, just so you can see what it would look like. And he was the anecdote is something like he flipped through it and looked at it and remarked that that's actually good. This is how it should be published, meaning that everyone has to write their own philosophy of freedom. This is the position that he came to in terms of, if someone were, like, even in some of these addendums in the second book, that starts to become more clear. Like, what is this? This is a path of experience. What I was calling it when I was thinking about this was a creative path to knowledge. So it's not a book for philosophy students. It's a path, one path to a creative path to a kind of knowledge. And he says that, yeah, it's not for philosophy students, but that it's towards a certain kind of knowledge. What he calls, he doesn't use this word, but the way he describes it, it's a holistic knowledge. And he does say that all of the sciences have been taken apart, and they need to all be knitted back together to form this new kind of knowledge, this holistic knowledge. And then he says, though, that this knowledge must be organically alive. So this idea of living knowledge becomes important for him. But in this same vein of what this book is, and everyone having to write their own, and the creative part of it, there's a very interesting letter that he wrote in 1894, so the year that the book is published for the first time. He sends a letter to his friend, who is the Austrian feminist writer Rosa Mayrader, and in this letter he explains that the book was not based on abstract theories, but is rather fully based on his own personal experiences. So in other words, the book represented his own struggle, according to him, to become a free spirit. And I have just an excerpt from this letter, which is quite revealing, I think, so I will just read that now. He says, quote, "I do not teach, I relate what I have inwardly experienced. I have related it in the manner that I have experienced it. Everything in my book," means Philosophy of Freedom, "is meant in a personal manner. Even the form of the thoughts. A more instructive nature might have broadened the topic. Perhaps I could do it myself in time. To begin with, I just wanted to portray the biography of a soul struggling to freedom. Here one cannot do anything for those wishing to accompany one over the hurdles and abysses. One has to see for oneself how to overcome them. One cannot stand still and first try to explain to others how they could most easily overcome them, because the longing for the goal burns too strongly within one. In any event, I believe I would have fallen had I immediately attempted to seek the most appropriate paths for others. I traversed my path as well as I could, and then I subsequently described this path. Now I could perhaps find 100 different ways as to how others should proceed. Only when one has arrived at the goal does one know one is there." End quote. So, like, what is being revealed there? This really is, it's almost like a journal, of a philosopher journal, which is also not that strange if you think about Nietzsche, because Nietzsche was just shooting out notes out of him, everywhere he went. It's basically like a journal entry. And then these notes had to be collected up later into some kind of coherent, manuscript or something. So it's a little bit, perhaps we could compare it to that a little bit, that he's documenting his own struggles to become what he says is a free spirit.
I mean, that's certainly, of all the things I would say that it is, not, well, outside of the content, whether or not it's philosophy or spirituality, the one thing you could say it is this is clearly someone who is, trying to process something in a fairly rigorous way. But the only issue with that, in that sort of note style, is unlike Nietzsche, Steiner doesn't quite have the ability to go the full way and transform it into a book. There are moments where it's sort of a bit revealing that it is just that, which is why those editions probably were needed, especially when he then goes on to consider it as important as he does. I guess he felt he needed to go back and rework it. But it's a bit of a paradox of a book with regard to the anecdote you tell of the blank pages book, because there's always the question of, okay, well, to what extent is this betraying its own point by being what it is? But I guess he saw something in it that was of such importance to have out there. I mean, but that's also sort of not fully right, because it's not like, fully just a journal. There is, he is making clear positions and arguments within it. So it is just this weird mixture.
Yeah, it's a mixture, I'd say, to put. I mean, he saw it, like when a person writes a book, especially a book such as this, on the other side of it, the author has come to a new place. I mean, writing a book is a lot of work. You have to work through all of these ideas and sources, and then you come out the other side, and maybe you didn't realize it through the process, but then on the other side, you're like, aha, now I get this, and I'm moving on to the next project. He's also, we should mention that he's young. He's in his early 30s when he's writing this. He's so he's been taking lots of philosophy courses. We'll get to and reading philosophy and working with philosophy. We can get to the influences next. So it's like, he's definitely making arguments and has ideas, but it's like almost as though he himself working through these ideas and making these arguments to himself, I guess. Like, there's that famous quote from Kierkegaard where he says, where he put this just phrase at the beginning of one of his books, to my one solitary reader, him. So there's the kind of something like that going on where he's working through all these things. And then as he describes it, he felt that was what was that time in his life. It was a kind of record of him finding his way through this thicket, of ideas and concepts. Mm. Yeah, but then it is interesting that it gets republished in 1918, and it holds this central position that anthroposophists will recommend to you to read this as though it's before your start. So I don't know how he thought about it in those terms. Perhaps he thought about it as like a good example, like a person. He does have places where he mentions things in this way that like, and I bet Gertrude does too, that we could just talk about that. But it's sort of like, you can go on this path and come to these spiritual insights yourself, but it takes time and development. But a good step to that is to see examples from people who have, or hear the results, the way Steiner puts it, hear the results of someone who has made it further down the path, and just hearing those results or concede certain things that you want to see and can't see yet, higher truths of some kind. Just hearing about that will like start to move you along the path.
Yeah, so I mean, in the spiritual, the sense of the spiritual path, there is a history of this, and it would be interesting to do a concordance amongst spiritual thinkers or spiritual gurus, if you want to name them that, where the teleology of any good spiritual guru's teaching is eventually to try get their students to the point where they go off and, metaphorically speaking, write their own philosophy of freedom and do the whole thing themselves. So, but the first part of that is this twofold thing of building up and destroying. So I think of, you mentioned Gurdjieff's Beelzebub's Tales says that its task is simply to mercilessly destroy in you all your prior opinions and ideas about the world, and then from that build something up, with Gurdjieff himself struggling to push away students to say, look, you've come as far as you can without now basically doing your own thing. And so Steiner, I guess, with philosophy of freedom, is the first thing he's saying to any potential students is like, the paradox of this book is here's something that's being built up ironically and paradoxically as a foundation for ethical individualism, right? That kind of can't make sense. So I guess in that paradox, you go forward with that notion of it can only ever be you, which most seekers ignore that advice and just cling to the guru. But there's plenty of, Uspensky also came to that conclusion. His student Rodney Collin came to that conclusion. And arguably that's there throughout the whole history of spirituality, is this point where you have to sever from the guru. Otherwise, what is this other than a sort of, dogmatic approach? I mean, I think Jung would very much probably say the same thing as well. And so the book in that sense is a paradox of spiritual seeking, because he's sort of saying, I'm telling you not to trust what I'm saying, but equally, the content of the book isn't necessarily dogmatic. It is primarily philosophical and fairly open, especially the monism versus dualism thing, which I think does lend itself towards something that isn't dogmatic. So yeah.
No, that's really good, actually. And I the way you describe it, I suspect that's how he started to see it, because what is the book is all about how to become free. How to become creatively free and creatively develop your own knowledge. Yeah. There's just endless, especially in the first edition, there's endless sections just talking about the anti-dogmatic, not anti, but like just illuminating the problems of dogmatism, compulsion, the state, all of these things that hinder the person from actually freely developing themselves to this freedom that he is describing.
Elusively describing.
Right.
I would say that, just not trying to toot our own horns here, but without a conversation like this, if you went blind into an edition without any of these addendums and all this historical stuff we've been mentioning, maybe you're a very, very acute reader and you'd figure it out. But I would say for myself that if I did that, I'd be like, where's the freedom? Like, where's that happening? Much like von Hamann, you also had that exact experience, right?
Right.
What are you gesturing towards with freedom, right? So without all of this, like, mass of of historical foundation, it's tough to really understand what that freedom means.
Right, and we'll kind of get to a little bit of what he's describing, but I do think that the way you just described it in terms of this, like, especially later in his life, is this spiritual, in this like part of the spiritual path, like the beginning of the spiritual path to eventually develop your own path as being the goal, you know? I think that's probably how he was thinking about it. That's probably how it's used, I suppose, in anthroposophical circles more, and thought about this way. But at the same time, it's difficult because the guru tells you all this stuff. The master tells you so many things, and you're like, they blow you away and they help you along the path. And then you're supposed to also then, distance from all that and carve your own path at a certain point.
I just want to throw in, actually, because you mentioned Gurdjieff, I'm just remembering now, he obviously has his trilogy. So Beelzebub's Tales is meant to destroy everything. Meetings with Oracle Men is meant to sort of rebuild on a mythological foundation, if you like. And then the one that's rarely mentioned, and this is the one that relates to Steiner's blank pages anecdote, the third in that trilogy, Life is Only Real Then When I Am, one of the most annoying titles to ever say. Everyone always says, oh, it's unfinished, and the book actually does just stop at this, like someone has literally, like, he's written a sentence and just walked away from the book and never finished it. And I always, in Gurdjieff's cunning, I always assumed that, like, he had a lot of time to if we're going to take Gurdjieff as he is, like a Steiner type figure as well, then he could have finished it. I think he was much like the empty pages thing. He was making a statement of, you're grasping at something. So the difference there is Gurdjieff was always being cunning, and Steiner, I think, was more to the point of he had a lot of like legalism, like he wanted to like get everything down and cross the T's and dot the I's for like everything. So
yeah, there's like a good German rationalism going on in Steiner. But it's also interesting because a lot of people, when they say they like Steiner, it's because this German rationalism is somehow applied to occultism, which normally is not what you tend to find. And so it is a kind of mixture of philosophy. I mean, he was trying to become a philosopher, and then he went and did esotericism. So the whole system is an interesting, perhaps even unique mix of philosophy, German idealistic philosophy, and occultism.
Yeah, I mean, so that's if you're here for the content of the book, you have to wait a little bit longer because we need to go through the influences.
Right.
Possibly we can go through these chronologically. Maybe that's a possibility. I think as far back, because there's others in there, of course, but as far back as we really go is probably Goethe, right?
Yeah. Kant is
okay.
Kant the first. Goethe is after Kant. And Goethe is also responding to Kant.
We begin with Kant.
Right. So for Steiner too, Steiner is also responding to Kant, like every German philosopher at this time. So
every philosopher still
right.
throw in.
And what do you find? Well, the interesting part is how much Goethe Steiner is imbibing and is inspired by. So it's mostly Kant, but then he just to list them off is like Kant, Goethe, there's some, and Schiller, and there's obviously Fichte in there because he talks a lot about intuition. And then you have Nietzsche and Stirner also in the background. Now, people like von Hartmann and even Schopenhauer, he was also editing some of Schopenhauer's papers. So his monism is also somehow linked to some of these philosophers too.
There's also something to add in here just for the history, though, because we come from a position of fairly thorough canonization where you can reel off those names for the German idealists.
Yeah.
1894, right? I mean, I don't know my history well enough to know. Obviously, Kant is extremely well known. Goethe, I don't know the history of Goethe well enough, so I don't know what his position in scholarship would be in 1894. But when we're mentioning figures like Schiller, and this is why when we say, okay, Nietzsche, modern mind might go back and say, oh, it's Nietzsche. It's like, well, not really, because the first English book, one of the first English books on Nietzsche is Orage's book, which is 1902, and then one of the other first ever books on Nietzsche is Steiner's. So when we're mentioning, and Steiner even to this day is hardly known. So when we reel off these figures, it's like in 1894, it might almost be like, why are you mentioning this, this really obscure Steiner guy? Like, why is he of such interest to you? And to what extent have other German idealists, people like Schiller as well, also been thoroughly recognized, and who is von Hartmann. So I just want to throw that in there. That's like, in his day, maybe this would have come across more like something completely different, right? Of, a young man's project who is excited about a lot of new philosophy. Who was it who famously commented that Steiner is trying to complete the system of German idealism with this book?
Owen Barfield, much later, but yeah.
Much later. Okay.
But yeah, it's a good point that he, like, obviously everybody knew Kant. Schopenhauer was well known. Goethe and Schiller were well known, but not like as philosophers. You know, they were literary symbols. And what's different about Steiner is he was given the job to edit the scientific writings of Goethe. So he took those seriously. And those are informing him here, which are not normally informing other people at this time, you know. Then you have Nietzsche, who is like a cult figure. I mean, he did have a following, but he's a cult figure in the city where Steiner is living, in Weimar.
Yeah.
So he has access to that. Stirner, that stuff's way in the background. Fichte is obviously well known. I mean, these are like a bunch of Germans writing, in the conversation with each other, like Kant, Goethe, Schiller, and Fichte. So he's definitely plopped right in the middle of all this and is learning it. Yeah, and I think they would be seen by a lot of people, like von Hartmann, for example, of a young man's interest in philosophy, enthusiastic, quasi-manifesto book. I think there was an element of that even because of where he was in his life. And he did then immediately go into Stirner, Nietzsche. He moved to Berlin and had much more very radical notions for a while before he then transitioned into theosophy. And he was also a bit of a troublemaker in Weimar during this time. I mean, when he got to Weimar, he felt it was very stuffy. They just wanted to have like Goethe as a museum, is the way he thought about it. He didn't like the classicism there. So he was already causing trouble. He was provocative, actually, in this period. So all of those things you can find are just part of the web, that out of which this book arises. So, but like I said, he von Hartmann, Schopenhauer, he was a proponent of Ernst Haeckel. So this materialist evolutionary ideas were also important for him. And one person I wanted to mention, which is interesting also, is Franz Brentano, because when Steiner was in Vienna as a student, he was at the technical school. So he was taking basically like engineering and physics types courses, but he loved philosophy. And so he would go to these philosophy courses, and he took classes from Franz Brentano, who had published in 1874 a famous book, Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint. And so he had this idea about using natural science and applying to psychology and finding exact laws of the psyche as we could find about nature using Naturwissenschaft. And so in these classes that not only was Steiner was in them, but Edmund Husserl was a student, and Sigmund Freud was also a student of Brentano. So you see that influence too, in my opinion. And then it was there that he met another professor who introduced him to Goethe, and then then he was all about Goethe for really forever, but definitely very strongly for a certain point there. So those are some of the background influences.
There we go. Now we can get into the book.
Yes. After that, I mentioned it's a long preamble, but at least you can understand the complexity of it at this point, hopefully, because it isn't the kind of book that one would pick up and start reading for fun,
No,
what would you do with that?
And also, it should be said, one of the other things with regards to philosophy, the title, The Philosophy of Freedom, is that you're not going to go into this and pretty much maybe 10% of the people we mentioned are going to be mentioned by name, but there certainly isn't the assumed scholarship we'd have today of footnotes and even a bibliography or endnotes on which texts and which influences. So when you talk of philosophy, it's it is once again floating in this in between. So you're not going to, without the preamble, you're not going to recognize those figures directly.
Right. Yeah, he does mention certain thinkers, but usually just to knock them down. But he doesn't. He doesn't. It's not like he's citing where he's getting these ideas. They're just again. This comes back to a bit of this journaling philosophy aspect, But yeah, we've transitioned to the book. I mean, what is the book about? The book is about a path to knowledge that Steiner calls freedom. A living knowledge is a free being can can access or can participate in the creation of a living knowledge. And monism is the key component of this. So the first half of the book is really developing his concept of monism, how he understands it. And then the second half goes more into what this freedom is supposed to look like, generally speaking. One of the main themes of the book throughout is the idea of conscious action and how a person can act free and consciously free. Mm-hmm. That's a huge theme. And then at the very end, there are some gestures towards something spiritual, even in the original. And there he starts to talk about things. Well, he was already talking about these earlier in the book, but he applies things like what he calls living thinking, which we'll get to, as a way to access a kind of spiritual perception. Mm-hmm. So overall, it's about how to become a free spirit who acts freely, and that it's describing a path that's supposed to be available for anyone. However, according to Steiner, this was his kind of a record of his struggle his path, his struggle to get there.
Which has a foundation of monism, strictly against dualism.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe I break it down just a little bit more, the contents of the book. Yeah. Okay. So we'll just think about it in two parts because that's easier. In the first part, Steiner talks about the place of the human being in the world and how knowledge about the world arises, and the psychological processes involved in perception and knowledge generation and so on. And he presents his theory of monism, that is, everything is consciousness. So the human being experiences the world through percept and concept. He uses these terms a lot, but so that's the dualism part. But then he talks about the imagination and thinking as being in the space between the percept and the concept. So both imagination and thinking are important for him. Thinking really is the most important thing for him. Thinking solves all of the philosophical problems. It is what the essence of the human is thinking. So, and also in the first part, he then describes how human beings are born, partly because of this dualism, but not only, are born unfree. The will is not free, but through self-knowledge and self-observation, and through the application of this consciousness and conscious thinking and creativity that he talks about, then it can become possible for the human being to become a free spirit. So it's like a development. You have to work for it. You're not just born that way. And the monist part is that part of the monist view holds that any action is unfree if it's compelled from the outside at all. It has to, the motivation for the action has to arrive 100% from within somehow. And this could be something like the conscience, one's conscience, hearing of a voice in within. This could be that, but at the same time, that voice that sometimes is referred to as conscience, or that faculty, or whatever we want to call it, it likely remains unconscious and colored by the external perceptual world and commandments. And Steiner talks a lot about thou shalt, the thou shalts out there. And so monism wants to find a way to get around that and to give birth to moral action purely from within oneself. So that's the first part of the book. He'll allow me now to transition to the second part of the book so we can just get a full picture of it. The second part then goes much more into like, how does this look, this free action that you're talking about, this free willing. The second part of the book is called, in the translation, The Reality of Freedom. First part is Science of Freedom. Second part is The Reality of Freedom, at least just as a literal translation. And so here the question of moral action and ethics is raised a number of times throughout the book. And perhaps this is because it's assumed that if someone is not following these rules, these compulsions, and this is also, he has Kant in mind here a lot, because Kant's whole sense of duty and the imperative and everything. If someone is not following these things, how could they be moral? And if they act freely, how can they be moral? And what does this free action then look like? And so Steiner says that this is not a system of ethics, however, but it's an anthropology in a certain sense. It's a way of being human that he wants to describe. Self-knowledge and observation is crucial in order to understand the motives of our actions. So a lot of it is about examining your own thoughts and then examining your own feelings as well. He talks a lot about feelings. And then also observing your own thinking. You want to be observing all of these things. And here Steiner eventually starts in the second part, develop the idea of intuitive thinking and what he calls moral intuitions. And these moral intuitions arise from something he calls moral imagination, which we could go more into that if you want. But this path to knowledge, he ultimately calls ethical individualism, which is attained through another term he uses of pure thinking, and sometimes called sense-free thinking. Basically a kind of, the free thinking that's not colored or shaped in any way by some external thou shalt or anything like that. So, the moral imagination, though, is interesting because he describes that this moral imagination that we have, this participates in the creative becoming of the world, of the ground of being. And so therefore, if you can act on the basis of this faculty, this is supposedly coming purely from within and not from anywhere within the perceptual field or from the external world. And so this, for him, this is kind of where he ends towards the end of the book. This kind of action is participating in the co-creation of the world, because we're in a monist outlook here. So everything is consciousness. It's a flow between the outer, that consciousness out there, and that small part of it in us. It's like a reciprocal flow back and forth going on here. So the two resonate and influence and affect each other. Mm-hmm. The individual consciousness and what we could call the ground of being, or whatever that one out there.
Do you think free sort of individual creation is probably a closer or better definition than actual just freedom?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that they went with spiritual activity. Creation is also more, creating something has a more of an active, the word creative, being creative, has a more active sense to it. So I think that's getting closer to what he's talking about. It isn't just being free as some kind of like platitude or slogan. It's this working how to create your own world.
Especially when we consider that the book, it's he said he defines philosophy as an art, right? It's
right,
active creation. So the whole thing is revolving around that.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to mention that at the beginning. That is also how he's thinking about it. And towards later in his life, when he's doing his anthroposophical stuff, it's all about art, creativity, creation. I mean, his point at that, not his point, but like his message, I suppose, at that point is the goal of the human being is to be an artist, to create the world with the world. It's a kind of this co-creation thing, this becoming always remains pretty central. But you can see him already trying, I suppose, to work to this idea himself. If we take what he said about this book as his own kind of record, you see him, working towards that view in his own way.
Yeah,
early on.
And that creation has its own, I don't want to say dualism because it's going to complicate things, but it has its own split at some point between living and dead, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we could just, the concept of, there's like a lot of concepts. One could spend time going through all the concepts or try to go over the whole, which is kind of difficult. So we're kind of just going to be spot choosing things here to explain a little bit of it. So he does talk about living thinking and dead thinking, and this remains part of his, even in the anthroposophical work, the spiritual work, those two concepts remain very central, and they are being developed here. And living thinking it's like a higher form of conscious thinking, creatively participating in the ground of being, whereas dead thinking is the kind of thinking we do when we're just like shuffling around or repurposing a bunch of other acts of thinking that have already happened and are now here, like other concepts and stuff. I mean, as I was thinking about this, it's quite strange proposition that he at a certain point, when I was going through this, I realized what he's trying to say is like, there's a way, when he gets into his ethics and his morals part and this ethical individualism, like he thinks there is a way that the individual can, through this intuitive and thinking and this imaginative faculty, can like receive a picture of how to act moral in a certain situation or how to be ethical. And this picture is like 100% generated out of the source of the being. And it's a creative picture. It's like a new artwork. It's not It's not influenced by anyone else's ideas about what you should or should not do. There's no sense of duty. It's a purely like artistic creation. Like if someone were to just suddenly come up with a painting or a poem, it just springs out of you supposedly. And so this he thinks that this intuitive thinking and these imaginations about morality and ethics can just spring out of the individual and then influence the will. And then you will act, you will, no pun intended, you will act in a moral way, but it will be in a completely original moral way, almost like every time. This is the artist part. So that's a very difficult thing to contemplate, because most people, especially Kant, said, no, we're going to give all of this to the state, and they're going to help us act in a moral way by giving us these kind of sense of duty and these laws and so on.
And this is why, we had to mention the influences, because anyone steeped in the philosophy, and the philosophers that we mentioned, can immediately see, especially when we're talking about this ontology and this notion of being a picture or an idea. On the one hand, you have Kant, you have the split between phenomena and noumena, but as this is all, and this is very rough and ready, but reduced in the sense of a reduction to the monism and, small bit of consciousness within singular being and all being, there becomes a relationship, as with the percept and concept, between the phenomena and the noumena and man's relationship with that. But equally, that is then also reduced into this strange German idealist spiritual reduction with the spirit, the Geist of Steiner, in the explicitly moral, individually moral sense, where no longer is the Geist, say, just a haunt, but there is a notion that the will can have an engagement with the Geist to perhaps, transform it in that moral pictured sense, which equally is a refutation of Schopenhauer. And also, so it's a refutation of Schopenhauer with regard to the will, but with regard to the consciousness, it's also a refutation of von Hartmann, who not as many people know in terms of his theories of the absolute, which we don't need to get into because it's very obscure. And it's two of the clearer sections in the book when Steiner takes them both to task. Yeah. But within this, all of these influences are there, and he is combining a lot. And perhaps actually the spiritual angle appears organically because it has to. Right, it's not sort of shoehorned in. The only means he has to thread all of these things together is with an engagement with a language of the soul, of the spiritual, and that's in the book it appears almost like the pressure points of like there's no other words within philosophy that can be used here, especially when he starts talking about the pure consciousness and right. Yeah.
No, then that's really good. And then in that case, one could take Steiner at his word and say, okay, you worked through this, and you did then arrive to a place where it was necessary for you to move into this next phase of your life. Because many people criticized him as saying, oh, you just dumped that whole philosophy thing because you're a failure and now you're a guru. That was the critiques people were making. And he always was trying to argue that there was an actual trajectory here that led him to that. So, and of course, this is the view held by the anthroposophical movement, and this was what Steiner said. And many critics argued this other approach, that he was just kind of jumping ship on his earlier ideas and joining esoteric movements and stuff. But this really is a misunderstanding of esotericism, in my opinion. And I do think that I see him as a radical thinker, actually. And his radicalism continued to push him, and it pushed him into esotericism, which especially then in Germany was not, and also still now, it was provocative and a bit rebellious to be involved in these Buddhist ideas, and especially for the older guard,
Yeah, I mean, there's also something intriguing there, you calling him a radical, because I think it fits completely, politically and spiritually, because one thing that John Michael Greer often emphasizes is that the notion of esotericism, occultism, or spiritualism, not the specific kind, but that this thing, the notion that it is, let's say, left wing or more anarchically coded, is historically very new, and we probably see it here with this text most thoroughly as one of the very early. I mean, I'm thinking of what years was was the beginning of Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn is probably a good touchstone for both the ending and the thorough capstone of dogmatic, systematic esotericism, which then, Crowley's like, right, I'm doing my own thing. Dion Fortune's, that's when we see the explosion. And many of them still continue in something that I would argue, in agreement with Greer, can be seen as systematically conservative, right? It's like, right, you do this, and then you do this, and then you're grading, and then blah, blah, blah. Whereas it's like, you get to go be an individual, and this is the only way you can do it. And I guess there's probably also, Crowley comes up with spiritual reasons for that, right? The dawn of the age of, are we going in Aquarius?
Horus, yeah.
But no, we're moving from Horus into Aquarius. We're moving into the age where that becomes the possibility, right? And so Steiner, I think, for those that are in agreement with those esoteric theories, this is kind of a touchstone of, here's a document of that transition phase.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, if nothing else, one could look at it if from a historical point of view, it's a good thing to point to show that transition happening for sure. And I was just realizing as you were talking that, he writes this book, and then he eventually does join the Theosophists. And the Theosophists, like Crowley and some of the others, they were pushing back against this older Masonic ceremonial, secretive forms of esotericism, and saying, esotericism for all, democratizing esotericism. And then Steiner, so that's a radical position that the Theosophists took, the most radical of these esoteric groups. And then Steiner then breaks from them, in 1911, and still has to do yet his own thing even more.
Yeah. And also like recursively culminating in the only way to really do this is for you to do your own thing, which, to go back to someone we've already mentioned, two people we've mentioned, which is Steiner and Nietzsche. Nietzsche says, once you read the Bible, everyone becomes their own individual religion. And Steiner says everyone eventually becomes their own Protestant individual sect. Probably mixing them up. But they both basically said exactly the same thing with regards to the future of religion and individual spirituality. And Steiner, of course, would say, be an egoist, right? Be your own. So this whole thing eventually, as Nietzsche makes clear, once that process of fragmentation starts, the end result is simply individual religion.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. Here's a part of it that's sort of deviating from the text, but perhaps not. We're deviating from the content of the text, but the general theme is still relevant. So, the motto of the anarchists at this time in Germany, the early motto was "Tu was du willst," which is also was Crowley's motto in his occult system, "Do what thou wilt," Yeah. So the anarchists in Germany were also using this at the end of the 19th century, this idea of "Tu was du willst." And this whole idea about we should publish the book with the empty pages because everyone has to write their own philosophy of freedom. There's another anecdote I could throw in here by a different writer named Michael Ende, and he was much later in the 20th century, an anthroposophist, German writer, and he's most well known for writing this book, Die Unendliche Geschichte, which was made into the English movie, The Never-Ending Story, in the 1980s. It's kind of a funny reference, but this guy was an anthroposophist, the German writer, and in the actual text of that book, if you read it in the German, if you look at his biography and some of the things he said, for him, that book was the representation or the picturing or something, or his version of the philosophy of freedom. And the whole point of the book is about a young kid who starts reading a story and then eventually enters into the story and is, part of the story.
And if I'm remembering right, I'm going by the film, which I think is actually a great film.
Yeah,
if I'm remembering right, what begins, as you could say, is an imaginative indwelling of the story, at the end fractures into the kid's reality in the film, right? So what's the dragon's name?
Volker, I think.
Volker.
Something
that he ends up in New York.
Right. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, exactly.
So
that's true.
The
right.
notion of freedom begins with the imaginative faculty, and then eventually that imagination, as per to use Steiner's language, the mid ground of the concept percept, fractures into reality. But equally, that probably good reference of what that journey is going to look like. Also, right? You're gonna lose the horrible horse moment or whatever.
Yes, to struggle and suffer. But then by the end of it, they're all
being chased, being like brilliant shot in that film of the dark wolf just randomly.
Exactly.
It's on your tail. You gotta get on.
Right.
I'm gonna rewatch that. So that's incredible.
Yeah, it's actually quite, once you realize the anthroposophical background, it's quite interesting. And there's a part in the book, which I don't think is in the film, where in the film, he's given this, also in the book, this medallion, the character on the other side in the imaginative world in Fantasia, this is called the Orin, which is basically like an esoteric symbol. It's an Ouroboros medallion.
Mm.
And later in the book, when the main character, the boy from this world, enters into that world and gets this Orin, this is after the Vernichtung, they call it, the nothing, has destroyed this imaginative world. And so there's nothing there but him and the child empress. And he has this this amulet, this Orin. And she tells him, like, you have to now create everything. And he's like, what? Everything's gone. And she's like, yeah, it's your job to recreate the whole Fantasia. And he has to, like, think of new species of plants and give them names. And he has this moment in the book where he freaks out about how can I think up a plant, like a new kind of plant. And he turns over the amulet, and on the back is written, Tu was du willst. So it's a kind of reference there to this part of a certain esoteric history, which I think Steiner is involved in, and so is Crowley. And it's a really good way to think about it is this moment that you're describing, where these theosophists and all these people were really breaking from all of that. This eventually becomes, in the 1960s, and even a little bit before, self-initiation, where, like, here's the materials, I emailed them to you, go do it yourself. You don't need anybody,
Yeah.
So it's an interesting trajectory just in terms of the history of esotericism.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of it is the origins of self-initiation is certainly intriguing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, okay, one thing I sort of want to, near the end here, just question is if such is the case, what are we meant to do with this book? We've sort of touched on this, but Steiner often, so as I mentioned to you before, the weird bell curve of Steiner is beginning with individualism. The bell curve goes up, and then he's like fully in anthroposophy, which is a very communal Waldorf school educational communal thing, and then really it ends with him, sort of saying, like, this was the most important thing I did. And the end of any spiritual journey is that moment of, like, full severance where you become your own guru, one could say. And so this is, like, paradoxically a book to be read and then thrown away, and then read and discarded.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess, because Steiner loves purpose, right? He throughout his whole career, he's always talking about meaning and purpose and humanity's purpose and these big sort of,
Well, it's interesting because they usually anthroposophists reread it and they're reading it again and again, I suppose, to try to absorb it, what's in there. But in theory, it is supposed to be read once, provided that you get it, I suppose, and find yourself in this as a free spirit, the way he describes it. At that point, then you're done with it. And then there's the whole spiritual world to be experienced consciously for him, But how easy is it to get there? I mean, maybe just a couple more things about what's in the book of what he's trying to get people to do. It really is a kind of psychology too, in some ways. This is early psychology.
Yeah.
He thinking for him is the most important thing. So even though there's a dualism, for him, thinking is pre-dualism. Thinking is connected to our I. It's embedded in the ground of being and participates in it. So thinking for him solves the dualism problem, because when he talks a lot about percept and concept, when you see a percept, which is just something out there, some content that has we can't interpret it yet, our brain automatically, or some part of us, our consciousness automatically assigns a concept to it, then we know what it is, and so on. But he goes on and on about that, but he says it's thinking that does that. And thinking does it before the two. It's the one that knits these things together. So for him, like, he has this, like, primacy of thinking. So therefore, when you spend a lot of time observing your thinking, you are like at a certain point at the end, this is again coming back to the spiritual point. You're in a kind of unique position. He says when you pop out and observe not only your wills and your desire, but your actual thinking. He says you're in another place. You're suspended by a web of spiritual being, is the way he puts it. So you're somehow, some part of you is outside of yourself, observing this other part of you that is taking place somewhere. I mean, he also talks a lot about the I. The thinking happens in us, you know.
Yeah, there's the same tripart division of self awareness is in Gurdjieff, where, you know, to draw both their languages together. And I mean, this is also, I think, a rough approximation, which is across any serious spiritual thinker, which is this notion of waking up, not being dead, right? Not being the living dead is, you know, you could begin with just normal thinking, which is kind of unwilled and basically sleep or dead. And then for Gurdjieff, there's the first phase, which is self-observation, which is like thinking about thinking. Mm-hmm. But then when you actually get to self-remembering, one way that's described is like someone poetically put it as a small piece of your consciousness is for God. So it's like you're thinking that you're thinking and you're conscious of you knowing yourself, which puts you in a strange, it's extremely difficult to do. But as per what Steiner is saying about you're held up by this spiritual plane, is like all of a sudden part of your consciousness, if we want to just metaphorically or realistically, it draws back to, you know, what Steiner is saying about with your consciousness being in contact with that full consciousness is a little bit of you has been placed there to like sort of maintain that relationship and not have the severance.
Right.
To sort of sever from the above to just to the below is to basically end up dead and worldly. And you can throw, you know, it's very easy to slot in religious spiritual metaphors at that juncture. But that general structure of you are dead or you're asleep or you are not willed, you need to wake up, and then after that waking up is a further thing, is like a classic structure.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, he's doing it purely in this philosophical language, but these other like meditative spiritual themes you could clearly find them. I mean, self-observation, you know, becoming conscious of your own actions, visualizing, using the imagination, like all of that is also part of lots of spiritual paths about how to develop yourself spiritually. But for him, it is interesting how much emphasis he puts on thinking, and this will continue with him because he has a chapter where he talks about feelings and mysticism. And he says that mysticism, he kind of makes a dichotomy between, as you were saying, with von Hartmann and Schopenhauer and what he calls philosophy of will on the one hand, and then feelings and mysticism on the other hand, where he says mysticism is like projecting your feelings out onto the world and just making the world your feeling. And he wants to like have a path in between these two, and it's thinking for him that can do this. So, but it's a certain kind of thinking that has to be developed. This is this living thinking. Eventually, it's called sense-free thinking. And when you're able to, embody this living thinking or participate in it, perhaps is a better word, then it just starts to automatically affect your will. Like your pure thinking becomes pure willing, he says, and then it isn't mechanically done anymore. And this is where you start to become to these intuitive thinking and moral imagination. So we don't really have time to go into it, I don't think, but he has a whole part about imagination and how you can use imagination also to affect your will, like using picture thinking to influence the will, not only to free it from compulsions from outside, but also to free it from feelings. You know, like thinking is the one that can cast away all of those influences on it and try to lift it up out of this dead realm, this illusionary realm, into a sort of free act that's original, it's creative, and he wants to say ethical and moral. And I suppose that is interesting in light of what we just said about do what thou wilt and occultism, because he is also trying to say, yes, anarchism, but you can also be anarchist and moral. And let me try to show you how that's possible.
And then, you know, not to end on a downer, but this mechanical thinking, he was pretty pessimistic about this near the end. So, you know, read Philosophy of Freedom and you might be able to get out of the dead future that Steiner saw coming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Is there anything you want to add before we delve into another 20 digressions of the book.
Yeah, probably not, because it would just send us around down another road. But we're just scratching the surface of the content of it. But I think our larger framing of it would help someone actually appreciate it better if they wanted to read it. So if you do decide to read this book, read it with this in this larger context that we've been describing about what it is you're supposed to be reading. Yeah. So I think that that's helpful. And I would also recommend people go on to Rudolf Steiner Archive website and look at the original version, and you could see it's the 1916 translation. You can see how vigorous he is there, and then also look at his more careful one, his next translation, or his next edition in 1918, and you can compare them. And like, the ideas are powerful and good. Like, I think they're good, powerful ideas. It's simply that they're presented in this unique way, which, yeah, can be difficult. But if you have the larger framework, I think it makes it more interesting, more likely to be excited and want to dive into some of it.
All right. There you go. Well, I'll put the links for, the Steiner archive in the description below. And you're still working on your Steiner 2-volume Steiner biography?
Yeah, lots of research going into the Steiner biography, and also just yesterday, or just today actually, I sent what I think is the final email in relation to my Routledge book, which is Max Weber, Rudolf Steiner, and Western Esotericism. So that's my original dissertation, which has now been heavily expanded and revised, and will come out with Routledge on March 10th.
There you go. Well, I'll put links for all that in the description below. But once again, Aaron French, thanks very much.
Thank you.